Imagine you ask a schoolboy after a long school day, with 2 hours of homework ahead of him, what political regime his school looks like. If the boy understood the question, chances are he'll tell you it's a tyranny, and he's a slave. Now, if you ask a political scientist, just as me, the same question, I would tell you the boy is exaggerating. Most schools are actually enlightened dictatorships, with dedicated teachers working for the benefit of the young population. Now, the young kid might be right about the slavery bit, though, if he's smart enough to quote Plato's definition of a slave, yes, as someone who accepts from another the purposes which control his or her conduct. Now, this remark doesn't come from me. I get it from a book which was published exactly 100 years ago, and was called Democracy in Education by an American scholar called John Dewey. Scholars such as Dewey, and there were several in Europe and the United States in that period, thought it was kind of a paradox that we prepare young people for those newly founded democracies at that time in ways that very often had very little democratic elements in them. Now, none of these people dismissed the importance of cognitive education, yes, in increasingly technological societies. But they thought we should also pay attention to the increasing complexity of society itself and how we prepare young people to act in those societies. Bertrand Russell, for example, who is a Nobel Prize winner, British philosopher, said that if we focus too much on cognitive discipline, he said, well, we give a student actually two options during their career, either to be submissive or to become rebellious. And he said, both of these states kind of hamper the full moral and social education of the young person. Now, I'm a scholar myself who studied the relationship between young people and politics, and I think 100 years after Dewey's book, it's really time to reconsider in which ways we can make our schools and colleges more democratic in nature. Now, if I say this, especially in this room, I should say what I mean by democratic. Yes? If we think democracy, we very quickly think about elections. Now, elections are actually just one technical elaboration of the democratic ideal for large-scale societies. Yes? And if you read democratic literature, you might find that democracy can equally be defined as this. Yes? This is a more deliberative form of democracy, which is a process in which, through deliberation, people as equals come to a common binding decision. Now here you have something where schools can work with. How? Well, you can think, for example, of a fixed moment in class every week, just as we have gym class, where students, moderated by their teacher, discuss the events that are important to them, both inside of the school and outside of the school. School councils, which have membership not by fixed appointment, but by rotation. And if you start doing this at a very young age, some schools do, by the end of your school career, you will have acted as a representative on dozens of occasions, everyone. Yes? And those school councils should have some binding decision-making. We could think about co-decision on the way sanctions are given, or part of how the curriculum is structured. And even with older students, you can think of co-decisions on a number of budget allocations that the school has to make for the students. Now, there are already schools actually experimenting with this, scattered around the world. And what they show is this does not lead to student-led chaos, but actually these young people are really responsible guardians of the community they are a part of. Now, you could ask me, why? Why should we bother? Why should we do this? Why should we do this? I think there's two important reasons. The first reason is actually that it would increase the trust young people have in our democratic institutions. For this, I can base myself on research I've done with a number of colleagues back in Leuven. We interviewed over 8,000 young people in more than 100 schools, and what we saw is when these students told us that there were more democratic elements in their school, we saw that these students also had a much higher faith in democratic institutions. Now, most of these schools were actually still very traditional in form, which means that if you would have more true democratic schools, I believe this would bolster this democratic faith even much more. And this is important in a time when we're told over and over and over again that trust in democratic institutions is really becoming a scarce good amongst young citizens. Now, there is a second reason I think this is important, democratic deliberation in schools. Why? Well, I think it will instill a number of skills in students that they would use throughout their lives, not only in political deliberation, but also in their careers and even in their private lives. For if you look at the definition of democracy that I've just given, basically it boils down to something we do every day, or almost every day. It's collective decision-making. For when it's up to you, probably it will be up to us Because most of the important decisions you will take in your life, many of them, you will take with other people. Yes? You will not be alone. And now we know that there are a number of skills that lead to more optimal collective decision making and a number of drawbacks that you can have in collective decision making. And I think there's 3 important skills you would learn if, as of a young age, you would have political deliberation within your school. And the first one is this. Now you would think if there's one thing you learn in school, it's this. But basically, in school you're not listening to an equal, you're listening to somebody who is actually a superior and who is giving you very structured information. Yes? And most of the time it's in a book in front of you, so my experience is you can do basically without listening at all. And there is no value attached to most of the information you get. Yes? Except if you have strong feelings about English grammar or whether, Earth turns around the sun or the other way around. But this is not how people talk in real life. In real life, people talk in a completely unscripted way. They don't bring bullet points to help you. And so we know that we only get a fraction of the information out of something we listen to. And so this also means that a good corollary of listening is asking good follow-up questions, which we hardly do. And so I think if students, as of a young age, moderated by their teachers, learn to interact in this way with each other, they would become better listeners. And they would also learn from the moderation to ask better follow-up questions. Now, if you listen to somebody, chances are they will say something you disagree with. Now, we know from research that at this point a very normal human reaction is to dismiss most or part of the information this person will give to you. Dan Kahan in Yale has demonstrated we even do this with factual and numerical information. We just don't listen to it anymore. Now this is problematic in collective decision making. We don't need to become hippies around a campfire, but we will have to agree at some point to come to a collective decision. Now how can these schools help here? And my response comes from a beautiful classical experiment in social psychology, which was done in the 1950s and which was called the Robbers Cave experiment. It could have been a Bond movie with Sean Connery. And in this experiment, a psychologist called Muzaffar Sharif used the boys' summer camp, which lasted 3 weeks, and he divided the boys into two groups. And he studied intergroup dynamics, and he looked what it would take to get the boys into competition and later on into conflict. And after a week and a half, this turned into complete open conflict between the two groups of boys. And this is how we best know this study, yes? Conflict is never far away, even amongst groups that have very similar traits. Now, as someone who has hosted a birthday party for about 10 6-year-old girls, I can tell you I'm especially surprised it took Sharif a week and a half to get to open conflict. In my experience, less than an hour will do. Now, the most interesting part of the study is the second part. After this conflict, Sharif and his assistants tried to see if they could remend the group, but, and this is important, while they stayed 2 separate groups. This is how it is in real life. And they showed that if you let the boys work together on collective decision tasks, this significantly lowered the intergroup aversity between the 2 groups. Now, this is what you would do all the time if you would discuss in class, and this is why binding decisions would be important. You would have to decide on something, otherwise it doesn't really matter. And now, finally, I think you would learn a third skill, and one we need all the time. We know from psychological research on fear that one of the things people fear most is talking to a group of people. Yes? There is a reason. If you're a TED speaker, you get a guide, and at the end of the guide, there is this mystical phrase that says, inhale, point, exhale. It assumes we'll stop breathing. And one of the most popular TED talks actually is from a psychologist called Amy Cuddy. It has over 30 million views. And she actually explains how she herself had to overcome her stiffening fear for talking to a public to make an academic career. And at the end of the talk, what Cuddy tells us is, fake it until you become it. She says, most of us fear talking in public, yes, but don't let it stop you. Pretend that you have self-confidence. Just go out there, do it. And after a while, you will become it. Now, wouldn't it be great if we as adults don't have to force ourselves to become it, but we would become it when we are young? If as of a young age, and you have schools doing this with kids as young as 7, they have to learn to talk to the group every week. They would learn to overcome this fear. Not to a point, this would not be a silver bullet solution that would completely eradicate the anxiety we have when we talk to a group. I'm an experienced lecturer, I still feel it. But I think it would lower it to an extent that we would actually say what we think in such a collective decision making. And this is important for our acceptance of the decision afterwards. For if you don't say something because you fear to talk to the group, you will still be bound by the decision that's made by the group. And we know from political science that this will lower the legitimacy of the collective decision. So it's important that you're not afraid to speak up and to learn this. So I think it's important schools should learn us this, and I think democratic schools would teach us this. Now, to end my talk, I want to give an example of an institution that actually used most of these elements, and it was actually based a few miles from where we are today, here in Warsaw, between the two world wars. And it was run by a person known as Janusz Korczak, who was actually a writer. This was his pseudonym. His real name was Goldschmidt. And he ran an orphanage for Jewish Polish boys and girls younger than 14, 15 years old. And the orphanage had its own newspaper, had its own parliament, and most famously, its own court. On Saturday morning, a number of the students, of the kids, sat as judges on their own peers, assisted by one of the adults. And what Korczak tells us is that they were rather wise and adult in the way they passed their judgments. But they could also find that somebody was guilty on the so-called rule number 1000, which meant you had broken the ground rules of the orphanage and you had to be expelled. So their jurisdiction was rather wide. And because the adults were part of the orphanage, Korczak said, well, they should also fall under the legitimacy of the court. So this was a joy he could experience several times himself, as he was charged by his orphans to the court. And once he was found guilty for stealing a number of potatoes during a field trip on the banks of the Vistula, when they had a picnic. Yes? Now, Korczak was so convinced of the surplus value of these institutions and on the fact that this worked very well with these young children that he thought in 2 or 3 decades' time, every school will work this way. Now, those of you who know Korczak's story know he never got to check the veracity of the statement. Yes? Under Nazi occupation, the orphanage was moved to the ghetto, and although Korczak was a very known public figure in Poland, and we know he was offered several occasions to escape this fate, he stuck with staying with the orphans, and in 1942 he perished in Treblinka, together with them. Now, so for me, as somebody who studied the relationship between young people and politics, Korczak is kind of a hero to me. So it gives me some joy that it's here in Warsaw that I can make a call to not only remember how courageous this man was at the end of his life, but also to rekindle the real wisdom he had of working with young people during his life. Thank you very much.